Alice Rogoff is publisher and owner of Alaska Dispatch News and co-chair of the Polar Initiative at the Wilson Center. Alice, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me ask you about your coverage of things Arctic over the years and what kind of growth you've seen as far as interest in the region.
Well, we at Alaska Dispatch have tried to emphasize Arctic news mostly because Alaska is an Arctic place, and so we know that the Arctic is a very important region of the Earth for the whole Earth and not just for people who live there or who commute there. And out of that has grown a specific news site called arcticnow.com, which is a compendium of news from partners who are first-rate journalists located around the rest of the Arctic, the International Circumpolar Arctic. But it's not just an aggregation site. We have a full-time editor who actively edits the material to make it a more cohesive whole. And we're in the process of expanding that to be more interesting, more diversified, everything from more aspects of social life and recreational life to more business news of and about the growth in the Arctic.
And the traffic on that site, are you seeing that grow as interest grows?
It grows slowly, but the people who come are very loyal. They come back and they spend more time reading it than they do on most sites. So,
how good of a grasp do you think people have on the Arctic when they think about it and think about these emerging issues and this emerging focal point for global interaction? Do you think people have a good understanding of the region?
Well, let's say this. There are about 4 million people who live in the Arctic. Of those 4 million, I'll bet 3/4 have a pretty good grasp. So let's say there are 3 million people in the Arctic who understand the significance of the issues in the Arctic. But as to the rest of the world, it's an infinitesimally small group of people. And that is just a function of ignorance, which is why I find myself coming down to the lowest common denominator when I talk to people. If I'm talking to Americans, I say, folks, listen up. We have a third ocean. Can you guess what it is? And usually the answer is the Gulf of Mexico.
Really?
And I say, no, you want to guess again? And then they go blank because they can't even imagine that something called the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait is the legal U.S. definition of the Arctic. And that coastline of the Bering Sea, all the way up to and including Barrow and over to Canada and the Northwest Passage, is longer than the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the lower 48 combined.
So I know you're writing headlines,
Yeah.
but talk about the trend lines that you've identified, things that you're covering that are going to become more and more prominent.
Well, we cover all the obvious. The hot buttons for many readers today are geopolitical, so that if there's a fighter plane coming too close to another fighter plane, of course we cover that. We cover oil and gas, particularly oil drilling. The Russians are stepping up their activity heavily in their own Arctic and just announced a huge find in the area where they were previously in business with Exxon before sanctions. But what we really try to do is cover then the issues that are of importance to us who know something about the Arctic. So we cover the people who live there and the human challenges they face, the social and economic challenges, the environmental challenges, which are huge in some places, particularly right now in Greenland, where there's an ongoing battle about who will clean up the former World War II stuff left behind, and there was an enormous amount of stuff left behind, and it's not clear who should pay for its removal. And then we try to cover little snapshots of life as it goes on at the local level, wherever we get those pieces. And some of them are poetic, and some of them are just kind of routine snapshots.
So how confident are you that those people who've lived in the Arctic all their lives and who aren't just discovering it, we'll do right by them as there is more and more international interest in the region? Are there enough checks in place? Are local voices being heard enough so that it will be a situation where local residents can benefit versus be exploited?
We'll put it this way. The Arctic Council governance structure, which is consensus-based, is of, by, and for the people of the Arctic. The quote-unquote observer states are those who are outside the Arctic. So as long as the consensus-based governance model keeps on working, then the people who live in the Arctic will feel like they have some self-defense against new pollutants, new intrusions, too much tourism, the wrong kind of tourism, heavy fuel oil coming out of cruise ships, sewage coming out of cruise ships, overfishing, all the normal things that could happen in the absence of good government. But the Arctic Council is a young organization, so for the people in the Arctic to feel confident about those outcomes being the right positive ones, it's going to take a lot more experience, and my sense is a lot more what we would call socialization of the issues, which is why I feel so strongly about journalism being important, because if people don't know these issues are out there being debated, it's very hard for anybody to have informed opinions. And I think informed opinions are the key to the realm in every aspect of life.
A final thought, Alice, is about just this specific day that you're experiencing now. We're well into the first day of the Wilson Center Arctic Circle Forum.
Yeah.
What's been your experience? How's it going so far?
Well, it's gratifying in the way that we had hoped it would be, because we're sitting in Washington, D.C., where the word Russia is now sort of a dog whistle for everything scary, everything bad, everything spooky, everything hacking, everything military conflict, and so forth. And yet, those of us who live in the Arctic, both Russian and American and others in the audience here today, know that we're just neighbors who coexist in the Arctic. And diplomacy, as far as I know, has always been a matter of compartmentalizing subjects, going back to the years, at least in history, that I know about. A foreign power and another foreign power could make peace over here while having somebody else spying over here. And they thought that was okay because it was their way of having kind of checks and balances. I gotta think the same is true with respect to not just the US and Russia, but the US and China and the US and Korea, South Korea at least, North Korea being a different case at the moment. But I really am pleased that we've had these members of the Russian parliament, the Duma, here, because of course they're angry at us over sanctions. We would be if we were in their shoes, that's human nature. But they're still talking to us. And when I personally went to Putin's conference in Arkhangelsk in late March, I guess it was, you know, he said something that really struck me, that sometime toward the end of last fall, he and his government had sent a proposal to the John Kerry then State Department for safe navigation rules in the Bering Strait. Now, of course, the Bering Strait is that tiny little choke point, 50 miles wide between Alaska and Russia, up there where we Arctic folk live. And in the middle of the 50-mile wide choke point, there are two islands and the date line and the border, Little Diomede and Big Diomede. It's very clear that Russia has as much a vested interest in safe shipping there as we do. They own Big Diomede, we own Little Diomede. It's not in anybody's interest for us not to have clear rules of transit in a body of water that's that narrow and that socked in with bad weather as often as it is. But the proposal that he sent the State Department had gotten no response. I didn't know that. Nobody in Washington knew that. You know, the media is a bit of a self-selecting tool these days, as it has to be. But that, to me, was a vital piece of information that the world hadn't heard. I still don't know whether there's going to be a response to it, but at least I know there is a piece of paper inside the building that says, we're ready. Help us come up with the rules of navigation. Those are vital things. Search and rescue is vital. Spill response is vital. There's nothing that we can't do together to make the conditions in the Arctic improve. The one exception, of course, is climate change. But mitigation is something that we can do together. That question was raised this morning. That's what this kind of dialogue is good for. Where is the methane capture technology that will start to keep the Arctic from melting at a rate that is not just twice as fast as the rest of the world, but more than twice as fast as the rest of the world? And as someone pointed out today, faster than even the most recent scientific studies are updated as they're being updated.
Alice Rogoff, thank you very much for joining us for this interview, but also for joining us and your role in this forum moving forward.
Thank you.